With Spider-Man, the eyes have it. Over 60 years, we have gone from this to this. Let's dive into the evolution of everybody's favorite wall crawler. Hey y'all, and welcome back to Carbon Scoring, the best place for comics history and action figures. The beauty of comics is that they are ever evolving, and lucky for us, action figures have followed suit. Nowhere is this more apparent than with Spider-Man. Let's trace the web spinner's evolution, starting at the very beginning. Sturdy Steve Ditko created Spider-Man's costume, and perhaps more importantly, his look. He wasn't big and buff like Captain America or Superman. He was thin, acrobatic, more fitting the body of a teenager. But it was more than that. His movement, his posturing, the things that make Spider-Man Spider-Man all came from the pen of Steve Ditko. But the Wallcrawler's first image wasn't drawn by Ditko. Editor Stan Lee rejected Ditko's cover to Amazing Fantasy 15 in favor of a more classically heroic image by Jack King Kirby. Hard to argue that Stan the Man made the right call there. There have been a bunch of first appearance Spider-Man figures over the years, but none of them have ever topped Toy Biz's 2005 Marvel Legends first appearance Spider-Man in the Sentinel Build-A-Figure wave. This figure is 20 years old, and it still holds up. It has all the hallmarks of that first cover. It has the spider logo that is exactly the way that it was drawn. It has the back spider logo with the little head on it. Now, granted, it's not blue because it was discolored blue in that original issue, but this is the actual shape of it. But most importantly, it has the eyes. Now, these are the eyes that Jack Kirby initially drew on that cover, but the cover was inked by Steve Ditko. So there's a ton of Ditko in that original cover. And it became readily apparent that Jack Kirby was not the right person to draw Spider-Man, and there's no way that the character would have achieved the level of success that it had without the artistic stylings of Ditko. He just was perfect for this character. But as you can see on these eyes, they're really, really thin, almost slit-like, and it just perfectly captures what we saw on that original cover. Spider-Man's look was ever evolving, and over the 3+ years Ditko was guiding the web spinner's adventures, Spidey's frame became thicker and stronger, and the black around Spidey's eyes became significantly thicker. This is a glorious time to be a Ditko fan. There have been so many great Ditko-styled figures released lately, beginning with Marvel Legends' 60th anniversary, Amazing Fantasy 15. Now, this is, of course, meant to represent the AF-15 look, but in so many ways, it's much more representative of the whole Ditko run. You can see the eyes are larger than what we saw on the Amazing Fantasy 15 cover. They have kind of the equal distribution of black, but they're still small like Ditko eyes. So while this does pass for an Amazing Fantasy 15, I think it really better represents the majority of Ditko's time on the title. But that's not the only one that we've gotten, because Mezco in their 112 collective line gave us this Silver Age figure that really captures so much of the Ditko aesthetic. I wish this was larger, but it's really, really Ditko on the back. You've got an extremely accurate spider on the front, and now we're finally starting to see some of the most Ditko eyes possible. Look at how thick the black is up above while still having good depth down below. It's got a little bit of that spiky point. They're kind of, the eyes are sort of flat. They don't angle up. They kind of come right across. This was, in my collection, the best Ditko head that I had until I picked up this custom. Now, I'm going to have information for all the customs down in the description so you guys can look into getting your own. But I have this one on Mafex body, and I added a little custom webbing underneath as well as custom hands. And for me, this has now become my definitive Ditko Spider-Man. Again, thick black, flat across eyes, good thickness to the black underneath. The web pattern fits the look of Ditko. This custom really does capture the master in all of his perfection. John Ramita Senior followed Ditko beginning with issue 39 and took Spidey to new heights in popularity. His wall crawler was more classically heroic, rounder, and more muscular, whereas Ditko's was angular and more lithe. Those classic lines of Ramita's extended to the eyes. While he kept the same overall shape of Ditko's, he subtly changed the black borders, with the outline thicker and more pronounced on the top edge compared to the bottom. The artists that followed Ramita, Gil Kane and Ross Andrew, maintained the same look, with only very small differences. And John Romita Jr.'s early art, which closed out the 1970s and brought the webhead into the 80s, was clearly inspired by his father's work.
If you grew up in the 1970s or 1980s, then John Romita Sr.'s vision of Spider-Man is exactly what you think of when you think of the character. His art was everywhere. It was on every t-shirt. It was on every poster. It was the definitive look for Spider-Man. And this retro cardback Spidey, I think captures it absolutely perfectly. It's a little bit more muscular. He's a little bit more heroic in his proportions, but the head really gets the subtle differences between the styles of Romita Sr. and Ditko. Again, you've got a little bit thicker on the bottom and a little thinner on the top. But one of the biggest differences is the subtle gradation up to the point on Ramita Senior's eyepieces. If you look at the Ditko one, you can see it's a much sharper angle up to that point, whereas Romita, it kind of is much more gradual. So it doesn't have nearly as much of a pointed edge. The eyes themselves actually look really similar, but there are subtle differences that are there. And this figure is the one because it is such a classic style for Spider-Man that I have used in almost all of my cover recreations up to this point, because you can place this in really any 70s or 80s scene and it fits in perfectly.
Illustrator extraordinaire and lover of all things 70s, Alex Ross mimicked Romita Sr.'s eyes, only adding mirrored lenses to his lifelike Norman Rockwell esque paintings.
The Spider-Man Classics line was a toy line designed for kids. They came with all kinds of play features and extra bonus accessories, but Toy Biz would sneak some serious collector pieces into that line, like this Alex Ross inspired figure. You can see it's got the distinctive Alex Ross design on the back, and these eyes are almost perfect Romita eyes, but with the silver lenses that Ross used on his paintings of Spider-Man. Just a neat way to sneak a figure into a kid's toy line.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of my favorite Spidey artists, Ron Frenz, who closed out the classic era by going back to the beginning with a very Ditko style, including eyepieces and web lines that were more similar to Sturdy Steve than Jazzy Johnny.
I picked up this custom head thinking that it was very similar to one of the Ditko customs, but as I've gone through this video, I realized this actually is a really perfect representation of the way that my favorite artist, Ron Frenz, drew Spider-Man. You can see it has a little bit wider eyelet pieces than what we got with a Ditko, and even a little bit wider than Ramita, but it has more of that curving uptick than what Ramita had, as well as fairly equal distribution of the blacks. Plus, the kind of splayed out web pattern really looks like the way that Ron Frenz drew Spidey in the 1980s. It's always good to see the artist on Spider-Man, when I started reading the title, get the credit he deserves for kind of bringing back a classic style, and it's amazing how well this head sculpt does that.
Frenz was also the primary artist during the symbiote costume era.
It was the brilliant Mike Zeck who initially designed the black suit for Spider-Man and got to draw it in the Marvel Superhero Secret Wars book, which is technically where it first appeared, but in reality, most of Spidey's adventures in this suit were drawn by Ron Frenz during his run on Amazing Spider-Man. And when you look at this design, not only is it just one of the greatest comic designs of all time, but it has a very distinctive eye pattern. And this one, representing those early 80s Secret Wars and Ron Frenz look, really is best represented by the one that came on the retro card back. And what you see is you get eyes that are larger than the outline of the traditional red and blue eyes, but they're not nearly as big as some of the ones that we're about to see. And they have that same distinctive silhouette, but this size and this shape really captures the Friends Zek era for the black suit.
But as the 80s came to a close, everything was about to change. Do you really think a predominantly self-taught artist who sent out over 700 submissions and collected 350 rejection letters before landing his first comics gig, when given a chance to illustrate the greatest character in comics, was gonna draw him like somebody else? If so, then you don't know Todd McFarland. Spidey was still wearing the black suit when Todd took over on Amazing Spider-Man, and he wasted no time in redefining the web spinner's look.
There are people that hate on the pizza Spidey body, and I don't get it because I absolutely love it. I think it is such a terrific representation of Todd McFarlane's style. It's nowhere near as stocky as a Ditko figure, and it's also not as heroically muscular as a Romita figure. It's just long and lanky and lean, and it just looks like Todd McFarlane. And this original Pizza Spidey black suit with those huge eyes is ripped straight from the pages of McFarlane's first couple of issues on Amazing Spider-Man. This just works. You know, he gets into such a crunchy bend, and those big, big eyes bring out all of the flavor that Todd McFarlane instantly brought to the web spinner.
But Todd was clear. He wanted to draw Spidey in his classic red and blues, and by issue 301, only his fourth on the title, he had redefined Spider-Man's look forever. Much like Steve Ditko, McFarlane's eyepieces evolved over the course of his run, and thankfully that evolution has been immortalized in plastic.
No single person has revolutionized the comics and action figure industry the way Todd McFarlane has. And so even back in 1997, when Toy Biz was getting away from doing figures based on animated shows and animated features and starting to do more comic accurate figures, one of the very first ones they produced was this Todd McFarlane inspired Spider-Man. And certainly you can see those lean muscles through here. You can see all the striations of everything. But the obvious difference are those eyes. We had only gotten small animated style Spider-Man eyes up to this point, and when they broke out the big old McFarlane eyes, you knew that it was on. But the 5-inch lines were quickly going the way of the dodo, and it was time to introduce the next revolution in action figures, the multi-articulated 6-inch figures. And this is the figure that I have deemed the most important figure in the history of action figures. And of course, it's that first Spider-Man Classics figure with a head sculpt based off of Todd McFarlane's early work on Amazing Spider-Man. And it captures that big-eyed look with the nice black around. You know, you have that athletic, limber body. It's just absolutely terrific. Now, Todd's style evolved as he spent more and more time drawing the web spinner. And later on in the Spider-Man Classics line came this figure. Again, you can see that the proportions are very different than what we would get with a Ditko or a Ramita. They're much longer, more lithe, more spidery, for lack of a better word. But here you get kind of the later version of McFarlane's eyes. Bigger, angular, a little bit of a different shape. Certainly the head shape has evolved from the more, oval shape to one that has like a visible nose and chin. I spent an entire video going through all of the minutia of Todd McFarlane's work on Spider-Man. So if you want to check that out, please do. It was all in relation to this figure, the new Maximum Spider-Man. And this figure is so good in so many ways. The articulation, the body scheme, the paint apps, the logo on the chest. But unfortunately, they really only got the eyes half right. This is pretty close to being a perfect McFarlane eye, whereas this, I don't really know what they were thinking with this. And unfortunately, they're a little bit too far apart as well. So we're halfway there. I have actually gone ahead and purchased custom heads for this Maximum Spider-Man figure, and I can't wait to get them in hand and see how they look and see if we really can get to the perfect, modern, fully articulated McFarlane figure.
Unfortunately, when someone totally revolutionizes an industry, all the competition can do is try to imitate. And in most cases, those imitators pale in comparison. Numerous great comic artists lost their way by giving up their individual style in an attempt to draw Spidey like McFarlane. Luke Ross was one of the better ones to emulate McFarlane's style, but even his figures would venture into parody trying to keep up with the master. Sal Bushima was one of the consummate pros of Marvel Comics. His 10-year run on The Incredible Hulk cemented the classic look for the character. He was even the original artist on Spider-Man's second ongoing individual title, Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man, which began in December of 1976, where his style melded nicely with the house style of Ramita. Even when he began his second stint on Spectacular in 1988, one that would last 8 more years on the title, his Spidey retained more of the classic era look. But the influence of McFarlane was too strong, and soon Bushima was aping Todd's style. For me, it always felt like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. But there were a couple of artists who built on what McFarlane accomplished while maintaining their own style. Eric Larson was the artist who immediately followed McFarlane on Amazing Spider-Man. Whereas Todd was heavily influenced by the draftsmanship of Neil Adams, Larson grew up on the bombast of Jack Kirby.
Eric Larson is one of the hardest artists to pin down a style to. He would actually have multiple different looks for Spider-Man's eyes in the exact same book. Sometimes the eyepieces were round, sometimes they were squinty, sometimes they were big, sometimes they were smaller. He really was kind of all over the place. But if you tried to go through the totality of his artwork on Spider-Man, the one thing that remained constant was the sharp, pointed corner, the high corner up here at the top of the eyes. Almost like, I mean, it's almost like Batman with his little pointed ears up there. And the alternate head that came on the Mafex figure, I think best captures that. You get the larger size that we're used to in the post McFarlane world, but the Larson point is what we see here. So I think this is probably our most accurate Eric Larson look at Spidey.
Mark Bagley went from getting his start in comics by winning the Marvel Comics tryout book competition to becoming the most prolific Spidey artist of all time. His rounded musculature reflected in the equally round eyepieces, consistently some of the largest in the wall crawler's history.
Mark Bagley has become a fan favorite, someone that creators now and fans think of as being on the Mount Rushmore of Spider-Man artists. But he had arguably the toughest job in the history of comics. He had to follow Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson on The Amazing Spider-Man, and he did so admirably. I have this custom Bagley head on the version 2 Mafex body. I think that the comic shading on it really kind of brings out that sort of 90s look. It kind of goes with what Bagley was doing in that era. But what you can see are the largest white eyes that we've seen to date. Bigger than Todd's, bigger than Larson's. And that was Bagley's hallmark, just the huge white eyes that almost take up the entire mask. Now, he does have black around. It's not too thin. It's a little bit thicker up at the top. But this custom head sculpt really captures the 90s Bagley Spider-Man art so well. But Bagley would have been legendary just for his work on the regular Spider-Man titles, but he went on to an unprecedented run on Ultimate Spider-Man with Brian Michael Bendis, where they reimagined Spidey as a teenager, and that will be his enduring legacy. And you can see there are plenty of similarities between his regular 616 Spider-Man and the Ultimate Spider-Man. They both have the huge round white pieces, bigger than even the width of the mask. But of course, Ultimate has a larger black area around it, which differentiates it from the regular Spider-Man. And the head is proportionately larger to the body to kind of bring out that teenage look. You know, kids, they have to kind of grow into their heads as they get older. And so Ultimate Peter always had kind of a disproportionately large head. And this custom sculpt captures that so well. So when I think of Mark Bagley, the most prolific Spider-Man artist of all time, it's these two looks that really bring it all together.
Thankfully, a new wave of artists would build on the past while still placing their unique mark on the wall crawler. Spidey underwent a reboot at the turn of the century, and J. Scott Campbell provided the covers. While some think Campbell simply mimics McFarlane's work, his bold musculature and unique flourishes signify a style all their own.
I have had this figure, another gem from the Spider-Man Classics line, referred to as a McFarlane Spider-Man more times than I can count, but I promise you, it is not. It is directly based off of the artwork of J. Scott Campbell, and there's some real hallmarks here to help you out with that. The bulbous musculature, just look at that flexing tricep right there. The huge oversized hands and feet. They're completely out of proportion, but with those pointy toes, that's a classic hallmark of J. Scott Campbell. And something that he was specifically doing during this era of covers, the spider logo is facing downward, something that only he did. So this is specifically a J. Scott Campbell. And while his eyepieces do look very similar to Todd McFarlane's, they're much more narrow. They're not nearly as tall or as wide. There's an even distribution of the black around, and they're kind of facing almost downward. So when you have him looking up, it's like he's looking up at you. Another just absolute brilliant figure hidden in the kids line of Spider-Man Classics that perfectly replicates comic book art.
Few artists had as much fun playing with Spider-Man's eyepieces as Humberto Ramos. He would change the size and shape of the eyelets to express shock, fear, excitement. They were almost a character unto themselves.
Boy, Humberto Ramos is the most divisive Spider-Man artist of all time. As I was doing my homework for this video and going through the different artists, there were so many comments that I saw about how much they hated his style, and those are all valid opinions. I get that. But I think you miss the point of his almost impressionistic take, particularly earlier in his career on the wall crawler. Here, you've got a Spider-Man Classics body, but with a new head sculpt, a new Humberto Ramos head sculpt. And this was in the toy Spider-Man Classics line, the giant black around the eyes. They're even slightly asymmetrical even in this example, but that squinted look was meant to convey expression and really kind of continue to tell the story. They released a second version with an even better Ramos sculpt. He has that rounded inside lens and then the squinty lens on this side, again with that heavy black from the Ditko style. But this one was just, again, a reuse of the Spider-Man Classics body. Thankfully, he got a figure that was completely newly sculpted and designed for his style. Look at these fingers. Look at how big and bulbous and stylized they are. Same thing down here with the feet. The latissimus muscles, come out in an almost cartoonish way, but it's the head. That squared off, jutted out jaw head with those classic Ramos eyes that make this one of the most unique artist-specific figures that we've gotten and a true representation of a visionary. You may not like Ramos' style, but you've got to respect the fact that he was not afraid to do his own thing when it came to Spider-Man.
While John Romita Jr.'s art started as a virtual clone of his father's, his style evolved into a unique, almost geometric look. Now into his 5th decade of drawing the wall crawler's adventures, JR Jr. continues to innovate.
When John Romita Jr. returned to Spider-Man in the late 1990s, he had left behind his mimicry of his father's style and developed his own unique signature look. Far more angular, far more squared off, just like this Spider-Man Classics figure shows us. Now, unfortunately, back at that time, Toy Biz was going a little bit heavy with the paint wash, and so this thing really comes out pretty muddy. But if you can get to where you can see the actual lines, it very, very much looks like late 90s JR Jr. art. Now, thankfully, I do have a custom head sculpt that I think really more clearly shows what his art style looks like. It's basically as if you took his father's eyes and then did like on the phone and just expanded them because the proportions are very similar to Ramita Senior. Heavier black on top, a little bit smaller on the bottom, but instead of those small white Ditko eyepieces, they've just been expanded a little bit. So this one really does capture kind of the modern look of JR Jr., who continues to be an innovator in the world of Spider-Man.
Ryan Ottley is one of the new wave of comic artists, having exploded on the scene with his stunning work on Invincible. With the end of that series, he jumped on Amazing, bringing his signature style, a combination of the cartooning of Ramos with the contortions of McFarland, and created something completely new.
Now we're getting into some truly groundbreaking stuff with this custom Ryan Ottley head. We've looked at so many different Spidey heads and eyepieces at this point, but they've always had a certain flow, a certain curvature to them. That is all gone when we start talking about Ottley. Everything is at an angle. The white has the inner angle. The black has a slightly expanded outer angle. And while it can be hard to see, there are sharp pinched lines right at the nose, which replicate his artwork perfectly. You know, Otley's work on Invincible was kind of, I think, mostly self taught, and his use of angular shapes as opposed to circular bulbous shapes really made the artwork stand out. And he brought that same style to Amazing Spider-Man. And it's so cool that we actually have those angular lines, which from a distance just look like Spidey eyes. But when you get them up close, you appreciate just how different this style is.
Proving that triangular eyes are the new style for Spidey artist, Marco Cicchetto has brought his own signature style to the Wallcrawler's adventures in the hottest Spider-Man title on stands these days, Ultimate Spider-Man. Even though this universe's Peter is older, married, with 2 kids, Marco's style calls back to the earliest Spidey adventures.
If you're not reading Ultimate Spider-Man, the new volume with the adult Peter Parker, hopefully this is the video that convinces you to do so. The artwork by Marco Cicchetto is absolutely spectacular, and the writing by fellow Clemson alum Jonathan Hickman is some of the most engaging Spidey tales that we've had. You know, having Spidey married with 2 kids, the dynamics, the family interaction, it just brings a completely new level of storytelling to our favorite web spinner. And Cicchetto's artwork mimics a lot of what we saw with Ryan Ottley. It's this new style, this more angular look. Again, from a distance, those could be Ditko eyes, but when you get them up close, you see there's no real curves at all. Much more angular, much more elongated, like they've been stretched out backwards, and they come together really tight at the bridge of the nose. It's not revolutionary, but it's unique enough to be singular and its own and allow you to recognize this character and this version of Peter Parker instantaneously. So we've talked about all this stuff. We've gone through 60 years of Spider-Man history, and truth be told, I still just like the Ditko the best. It's the one that is always going to be the baseline Spider-Man for me. I'm a huge Todd McFarland fan. I absolutely appreciate everything he did to bring the character into the modern age, but I'm also a classicist, and so I love me some Ditko Spidey. But who was your favorite? What did you learn from this video? What were some things that you now recognize with Spider-Man's design and eyes that you didn't know before? Let me know in the comments. And as always, for the best in comics history and action figures, subscribe to Carbon Scoring.